Une question qui revient souvent, Chomsky est anarchiste et pourtant il n'est pas vraiment opposé à l'existence de l'État. Retour sur Chomsky et compagnie, Jean Bricmont à Bruxelles.
Je pense qu'il est très différent, comme il l'explique dans le film, différent des anarchistes contemporains parce qu'il ne considère pas que la lutte contre l'État est nécessairement la priorité aujourd'hui dans tous les cas, dans toutes les circonstances, etc. Parce que l'État est entre autres comme il dit, il faut étendre les barreaux de la cage, c'est-à-dire il dit, c'est vrai que l'État est une cage, mais en dehors de la cage il y a les fauves, et les fauves ce sont des grandes compagnies privées, et d'une certaine façon la cage nous protège des fauves, et donc il faut se rendre compte que ce qu'il faut c'est étendre les barreaux de la cage, mais pas retirer la cage tout de suite, sinon on va se faire manger par les fauves.
Il faut le dire, la fameuse métaphore de la cage, empruntée à des travailleurs brésiliens, a suscité beaucoup de commentaires de la part des spectateurs, notamment les spectateurs de sensibilité libertaire. Depuis notre entretien avec Chomsky en avril 2007, la crise est venue bouleverser certitudes et perspectives. Crise économique, crise financière, qui a fait ressurgir un mot qui n'était plus utilisé que par quelques vieux gauchistes attardés, le mot capitalisme. Crise du capitalisme, chute du capitalisme, réformer le capitalisme, moraliser le capitalisme. On a entendu ce genre de discours au sommet des États. On a vu les États intervenir pour renflouer le système financier, alors même que l'État, disait-on, s'était effacé devant l'économie financiarisée et la miraculeuse autorégulation du marché.
Dire la vérité aux Français, c'est leur dire d'abord la vérité sur la crise financière. Parce que cette crise, sans équivalent depuis les années 30, cette crise financière marque la fin d'un monde qui s'était construit sur la chute du mur de Berlin et la fin de la guerre froide. Ce monde avait été porté par un grand rêve de liberté et de prospérité. La génération qui avait vaincu le communisme avait rêvé d'un monde où la démocratie et le marché résoudraient tous les problèmes de l'humanité. Cette génération avait rêvé d'une mondialisation heureuse qui vaincrait la pauvreté et la guerre. Ce rêve a commencé à devenir réalité, des frontières se sont ouvertes, des millions d'hommes ont été arrachés à la misère, mais le rêve s'est brisé sur le retour des fondamentalismes religieux, des nationalismes, des revendications identitaires, le terrorisme, les dumpings, les délocalisations, les dérives de la finance globale, les risques écologiques, l'épuisement annoncé des ressources naturelles, les émeutes de la faim. Au fond, c'est une certaine idée de la mondialisation qui s'achève avec la fin du capitalisme financier qui avait imposé sa logique à toute l'économie et avait contribué à la pervertir.
Depuis quelques mois, on a vu réapparaître ce mot capitalisme.
Well, the word capitalism is very obscure. I mean, is what we have capitalism? I mean, not in the sense Marx wouldn't have called it capitalism. I mean, we have systems that rely, economic systems that rely very heavily on the state sector for innovation, for development, and so on. In fact, almost everything that we use and is considered a hallmark of modern capitalism derives from the state sector. I mean, you flew over on an airplane. Airplanes are very interesting examples of modern capitalism. There are now two major builders of aircraft in the world, Airbus and Boeing. They're constantly in disputes at the World Trade Organization about which one is violating the rules more than the other. I mean, Airbus is simply subsidized directly by the European countries, so it's in gross violation of the rules. Boeing, when you fly in a Boeing aircraft, you're flying in a modified bomber. Boeing gets most of its technology, metallurgy, avionics, and so on from the military system. So this is probably the main civilian export of the advanced industrial economies. There are two producers, so there's no competition, and they're both outgrowths of the state sector. Or take the information technology revolution, which was the great exciting development of the late 1990s. We have this wonderful new information technology. Where'd that come from? It came from places like MIT 30 years before. That's where you had the development of computers, the internet, complicated software, and so on, all within the state sector for almost 30 years. So what's capitalism? What we call capitalism is state publicly supported private ownership. When people talk these days about the crisis of capitalism, they're talking about something very narrow, the crisis of a particular model of financial institutions, which was instituted in the 1970s based on mythology about efficient markets. And that model has indeed collapsed. In fact, if you take a look at modern economic history, the countries that developed, England, the United States, France, Germany, Japan, all developed with the crucial intervention of the state sector. So, for example, the United States was the most protectionist country in the world until the mid-20th century, and it's the one that grew fastest.
Aujourd'hui, General Motors ne peut plus payer ses dettes. Ses pertes atteignent les 82 milliards de dollars. L'entreprise va tout à l'heure déposer le bilan. En fait, c'est un nouveau point de départ avec un plan de sauvetage à la clé. L'État fédéral détiendra 60% du capital de l'entreprise et deviendra le vrai patron. En échange, l'État versera 30 milliards de dollars d'aide. Il y a quelques semaines, il avait déjà versé 20 milliards. Il faudra restructurer. 11 usines seront fermées, 3 connaîtront le chômage technique. Le dépôt de bilan de General Motors, c'est une part du rêve américain qui se brise. Pendant longtemps, première entreprise automobile au monde, l'une des plus grandes sociétés aux États-Unis, beaucoup d'Américains y restent très attachés.
Et aujourd'hui, c'est bel et bien l'État qui vient au secours de ce système capitaliste en difficulté.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's described as an innovation, and people worry about too much state involvement. But it's not an innovation; it's the norm. Aircraft, computers, the internet, and so on. And it's not just protectionism. That's a small part of it. Development, research, development, entrepreneurial initiative, procurement, these are all major factors. And you see it when you look at individual cases. So take computers. When I came to MIT 50 years ago, a computer was the size of this whole collection of offices and almost unusable, certainly not marketable. Over several decades and almost entirely within the state sector, computers became small enough so that you could sell them for profit. So for example, IBM was here in the 1950s learning from military research how to shift from punched cards to electronic computers. Now, by the 1960s, they had learned enough to produce their own computer, but it was so huge and massive that no business could buy it, so the government bought it. I mean, it wasn't until the 1980s that they could produce them for the consumer market. That's after 30 years of research, development, innovation, and so on within, at public expense. Take the internet. The internet also started here about 1960, roughly. Until into the 1980s, it was completely funded by the military. It was a military system, which others could use. Then it was turned over to the National Science Foundation, so still at public expense. It was only about 1995 that it was handed over to the private sector. That's after about 35 years. And that goes back as far as you like. I mean, the American system of mass production, which kind of astonished the world in the mid-19th century, it was mostly developed in military armories. The biggest economic project in the mid-19th century was railroads. They were way beyond the capacity of private enterprise to deal with. So they were run by the military, by the state sector. So they were run by the military, by the state sector. Now, there are countries that have followed market principles. That's what we call the third world. They had them rammed down their throat by force, so they didn't develop. And when the rich countries get into trouble, they immediately call on the state. So take Ronald Reagan. He's regarded as the high priest of free markets. He was the most protectionist president in post-war American history. He doubled protectionist barriers to try to preserve U.S. industry from a more efficient Japanese production. And that goes right through history. I mean, the British, by around 1850, thanks to massive state intervention, had become the most advanced industrial power in the world. So they were very happy to have free trade. Everyone's happy to have free trade if they're going to win in the competition. Yeah. By the 1920s, British industry couldn't compete with the Japanese. So therefore they called off free trade and closed off the empire. And that's one of the factors that led to World War II. So what's called the crisis of capitalism is just the collapse of an effort to act like the third world, a brief effort to act like the third world in the area of finance. And of course it collapsed. So yes, we're now calling in the state to bail out private enterprise. Normal.
On ne peut pas compter sur l'État ni sur les représentants de l'État pour réformer le capitalisme ni moraliser le capitalisme.
What they're doing is entering to sort of patch up the financial system, which was allowed to be a free market system for several decades and therefore collapsed. And now the state is coming back in to reconstitute it in such a way that it can survive with state support, the way the rest of the economy works.
J'ai promis que les mêmes causes ne produiraient plus les mêmes effets. La France a exigé des changements pour moraliser le capitalisme, promouvoir l'entrepreneur sur le spéculateur, sanctionner les excès inacceptables qui vous ont scandalisé à juste titre, pour redonner à la dimension humaine toute sa place dans l'économie. Nous obtiendrons des résultats.